Sometimes the only way to stop being someone else's collateral is to become someone they can't afford to touch. Her half-brother's voice had been almost gentle when he told her. That was the worst part, not the words themselves. We owe Harcount a debt, and you're going to settle it, but the way Remy said them, like he was reading off a grocery list. Like Isla had been a line item all along, and he'd just finally gotten around to circling her. She was 23, and she'd been doing his books since she was 19. 4 years of spreadsheets and offshore accounts and shell companies she'd built from his scrawled napkin notes. 4 years of making sure Remy Duval looked like a legitimate businessman while she ate dinner standing over the kitchen sink because he didn't want her sitting with clients. 4 years of being useful in every way that didn't require anyone to acknowledge her name. And now she was being handed over. The rain came down hard that night. She remembered that. She remembered it because she'd left her umbrella at the office. Remy's office, the one with her name on 0 documents, and she'd stood at the top of the steps thinking I could run. She had $62 in her account. She had nowhere to go. Her mother had stopped returning her calls 3 years before. Somewhere around the time Remy had convinced her that Isla was a problem, a leech, an embarrassment to the family's reputation. So she didn't run. She got into the car. The man who met her at the door of the building on Calloway Street. Not Harcount himself. Some intermediary in a suit that cost more than her rent. Looked her over the way you look at a piece of furniture you're considering returning. He made a phone call. He spoke in a voice too low for her to catch the words. Then he showed her to a room on the 3rd floor and told her someone would be by in the morning. The room was nicer than any place she'd ever lived. That made it worse somehow. She didn't sleep. By 7 a.m. she'd gone through every drawer in the room, catalogued the exits, counted the floors down to street level from the window, and determined that the building had at least 12 full-time staff, based on the pattern of footsteps she could track through the ceiling and floor. By 8 she'd found the household accounts binder someone had carelessly left on the desk, or not carelessly, she'd realize later, and she'd been reading it for 20 minutes when the door opened. The man who walked in was not what she expected. She didn't know what she'd expected. Something louder, maybe. Something with more visible threat. Harcount. Because it was Harcount. She knew his face from a photograph Remy had left on his desk once. The kind you keep to remind yourself who you owe. Was tall in the way that came from economy of movement rather than size. He had dark hair going silver at the temples, and a jaw that looked like it had been broken and reset at least once. He wore a charcoal jacket over a white shirt with no tie, and his hands, when he reached to close the door behind him, had the kind of scars that didn't come from kitchens. He looked at her sitting there with his household ledger open in her lap and said nothing. She said, "Your petty cash reconciliation hasn't been balanced in 4 months. You're hemorrhaging about $1,100 a week, and whoever's supposed to be catching that isn't." A pause. "Is that right?" he said. "The discrepancy pattern suggests either a skimming problem at the vendor level or someone internal with purchase order access. I'd need more data to tell you which." She closed the binder, set it on the desk with care. "I'm assuming I'm not here to do your accounting." "You're here," Harcount said, crossing to the chair across from her and sitting like someone who never moved faster than he chose to, "because your brother owes me $400,000 and made a creative offer instead of a payment. Remy isn't my brother. Half. He's my half-brother," she said. "There's a difference." Harcount studied her. She'd been studied before, by Remy's clients who wanted to know if she was trustworthy, by his lawyers who wanted to know if she'd talk, by the woman at the unemployment office who'd had to explain, twice, why Isla didn't qualify for benefits from a company that had never officially employed her. She was used to being assessed and found insufficient. Harcount's expression didn't have the same dismissiveness. He looked like he was reading her the way she'd read that ledger. "What do you want?" he asked. The question so surprised her that it took a moment to answer. "What?" "Duval made you a currency. That's done." "I'm asking what you arrangement." She thought about her $62. She thought about 4 years of going unacknowledged, She thought about running and having nowhere to go. "I want my name on something," she said. "Whatever I work on here. I want to be a person with a record of existing. That's a strange thing to ask for. It's what I want." He was quiet for a moment. "Then, you found a discrepancy in 20 minutes with a ledger you weren't supposed to have access to. It was on the desk. Nothing in this building is on a desk by accident." He stood. "Get some sleep. You look like you haven't in 2 days." He moved toward the door and then paused, hand on the frame. "Harcount Holdings. It's what everything runs through. Whatever you touch here, it runs through that entity. Your name will be on the filings." He left. She sat with that for a long time in the grey morning light. She had a name. Or the start of one. The first 6 weeks were strange in the particular way of things that are dangerous, but not immediately painful. Like realizing the ice you've been walking on is thin, but not yet cracked. She was given a workspace on the 2nd floor, a locked laptop, and access to a set of accounts that she understood immediately were only a fraction of the real picture. She was being tested. She knew that. She tested back, doing the work meticulously and flagging exactly 3 irregularities that she was almost certain were planted to see if she'd report them. She reported all 3. Harcount received the reports through an assistant named Crosby, who was bald and had the expression of a man who had seen enough that very little registered anymore. He delivered her a larger set of access credentials the following day and said, "Mr. Harcount notes your instincts are adequate." "Adequate," she repeated. "He says things like that," Crosby said, not unkindly, and left. She learned the building. She learned its rhythms the way she'd learned Remy's household. Who came when, who deferred to whom, which doors were always locked and which were only locked sometimes. She learned that Harcount had 3 senior men she thought of collectively as the architecture of whatever he ran. A lawyer named Spence, who looked like a senator, and argued like a surgeon, a logistics man called Pruitt, who never sat down in meetings, and a woman named Galvez who handled things Isla was given no details about, and was smart enough not to ask. She learned that Harcount himself arrived at 6:30 every morning, was unreachable between noon and 2, and took no personal calls during working hours. She learned that he had a habit of stopping in the doorway of her workspace in the late afternoon, looking over her shoulder at whatever she had open, and saying nothing before moving on. The 3rd time he did it, she said, without turning around, "If you have notes, you can say them." "I don't have notes." "Then why are you standing there?" A pause. "Checking on the work, on whether you're going to disappear," he said. "A lot of people do, when they realize what this place is." She turned around. He was leaning against the doorframe, and in that light she could see more of the wear on him. Not just the jaw, but the way he held his shoulders like he'd stopped waiting for rest a long time ago. She thought of words like siege and siege mentality, and how some people just lived inside that. "I have $62 to my name and a half-brother who sold me to clear a debt," she said. "Where exactly would I disappear to?" Something shifted in his face that she didn't have a name for yet. "Fair," he said, and left. She turned back to her screen. Her hands were not steady. The thing nobody tells you about living inside a dangerous thing is that it mostly feels like work. There were no dramatic revelations in the first 2 months, no room full of guns, no bodies, nothing her imagination had conjured during those sleepless first nights. There was a great deal of freight documentation that was double-labeled and needed reconciling. There was a series of properties generating income with tax filings that didn't match. There was a vendor relationship with a company in Rotterdam that made no geographic sense for the services it was supposedly providing, and when she flagged it and Harcount came down to her workspace himself rather than sending Crosby, she understood it was significant. "Where did you find this?" he said. "The Rotterdam contract." She pulled up the screen. "This company, Velstad Group, billed you for consulting services 3 times in the last quarter. The billing address puts them in the Netherlands, but the payment routing goes through 2 intermediaries and lands in an account in Bucharest, and the service's description is vague enough to cover almost anything." She paused. "Someone is using your structure to move money you didn't sanction." Harcount stood behind her for a long moment. She could feel the weight of his attention the way you feel a change in pressure before weather. How long to trace it back, if I had full access to the payment records? A week, maybe 10 days. You'll have it by tonight. He straightened. She turned to look at him. This was Duval's work, he said. It wasn't a question. The filing structure matches his. I'd know his accounting anywhere. She held his gaze. Remy set you up. He gave you me so you'd stop looking at the Rotterdam contracts. The silence that followed had a texture she couldn't read. Harcount's face had gone still in a way that was less like calm and more like the moment before a controlled detonation. Find everything, he said. Every line. I want to know the full scope. And then, he said quietly, your debt is cleared. She didn't ask what happened after. She didn't ask what happened to Remy. She told herself she didn't care and spent the next 9 days working 18 hours at a stretch, building a document that mapped every fraudulent transaction she could find, every routing trick, every shell within a shell. It was the cleanest, most thorough work she'd ever done, and somewhere in the middle of the third night she understood it was because she wanted to, because this was the first time the work was hers, and she knew it would be credited to her, and that she was, for the first time in 4 years, functioning like a person with a name. She slept 2 hours. She finished the document. She sent it to Harcount at 5:40 in the morning and then sat in the quiet of her workspace and waited. He appeared at 6:45. Not Crosby. Harcount himself. He stood in the door and looked at her with that same unreadable expression and said, "This is thorough. I know. You've been here all night. I sleep better when I'm working," she said, which was only partly true, and he probably knew it. He came into the room for the first time. He'd always stayed in the doorway and sat down across from her desk. In the early morning light, the scars on his hands were more visible. She found herself wondering, not for the first time, about the story of each one. Your debt is cleared, he said, as this document. She nodded. You could leave, he said. I could, but... She looked at the screen. At the entity name at the top of the filing, Harcount Holdings, her name in the signatory field, a record of existing. But I'm good at this, she said. And you have a problem, you need someone good at it. She met his eyes. And I don't trust anyone to not be Remy. At least here I know what I'm dealing with. His expression did the thing again, the thing she still didn't have a name for. What are your terms? He said. She'd thought about this. She was always thinking about this now, building arguments and contingencies the way she built spreadsheets, column by column, salary, benefits, my name on everything I touch, and I want to see the full picture, not the portion you think I need. That's a significant ask. You asked for my terms. I did. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the full picture is not comfortable to sit with. I didn't come from a comfortable situation, she said. I'd rather know what I'm in than be surprised by it. He held her gaze for a long time. Then he said, done. She stayed. The weeks became months. The months started to accrete into something that felt, cautiously, like a life. The full picture was not comfortable. He'd been right about that. There were things she filed and didn't look at too closely, and things she built safeguards around with the focused precision of someone diffusing a mechanism she didn't fully understand. She asked questions when she needed to and didn't when she didn't. She got better at reading Harcount's silences, which were varied and had distinct registers. The silence that meant he was calculating, the silence that meant he was displeased, the silence that meant something else entirely, that she tried not to think about too much. She ate dinner in the building now, not standing over a sink, at an actual table in the kitchen, which she shared with Crosby and sometimes Pruitt, and occasionally, unexpectedly, with Harcount himself. He ate the way he did everything, with economy without waste. He asked her things. Not about work, which surprised her. He asked about the logistics vendor she'd restructured. He asked about the Rotterdam cleanup. He asked her once what she'd wanted to be, before, like there was a before and she had things she'd wanted. An accountant, she said. That's what you are. I wanted to be one officially, with credentials, a degree. Why didn't you? She thought about how to say Remy told me I couldn't afford it, and then made sure I couldn't afford it, without it sounding like a wound she was still pressing on. "Circumstance," she said finally. He looked at her across the table. "Finish the degree," he said. "We'll work around it. I'm not asking you to. I'm not offering charity," he said. "You're the best structural mind I've had in this building. I want it at full capacity." He went back to his food. "Find a program. Crosby will handle the logistics." She didn't say anything for a moment, then, "Thank you." He looked up briefly. "Don't thank me. It's a business decision." She suspected that was at least partly a lie, but she let him have it. The crisis, when it came fast. She'd been there 8 months. The Rotterdam cleanup had led through a chain of connections that Harcount's people spent 2 months pulling on, back to a man named Forsyth, a rival with a long memory and a particular grudge against Harcount that predated Isla's arrival by years. Forsyth had used Remy as a vehicle, and Remy had used her as a decoy, and the whole structure was more deliberate than she'd realized when she was just tracing accounting lines. Forsyth escalated. The escalation didn't reach her directly at first. It reached the building, the operation, the people around her. There were days when Pruitt's jaw was set in a way she'd learned to read as ongoing emergency, when Galvez disappeared for 36 hours and came back with no explanation, when she came into her workspace in the morning and found it had been swept. She could tell by the slight displacement of items she'd memorized. For devices she hadn't placed there, she kept working. She built a secondary financial structure, unprompted, that would allow the operation to function if any of the primary accounts were frozen or flagged. She cross-referenced every external contact that had touched the Rotterdam network and built a risk matrix that covered 47 individuals, their connections to Forsyth, and their likelihood of being leveraged against Harcount Holdings. She put it on Harcount's desk herself. He was on a call when she came in, something low and terse that stopped when he heard the door. He looked at the document. He looked at her. She said, "Page 4 is the most urgent. The intermediary in the second tier of the Reuters contacts is about to move against the Portland property. You have maybe a 48-hour window." He put down the phone entirely. "How did you?" "The cash flow pattern. 2 weeks ago it changed frequency without a corresponding volume change. That's a stall pattern. Someone is positioning for a specific moment." She met his eyes. "I'm not overstepping. You can tell me if I'm overstepping." "You're not overstepping," he said. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard before, not the controlled flatness of his usual register, but something slower. "You built this in the last 12 hours? I had the components. I just assembled them." He stood. He crossed the room and stood in front of her, and she became very aware of how rarely he came close, how the space around him was usually maintained, how this was different. "If something happens," he said quietly, "you are to go to Crosby. Immediately. He has instructions. I don't need. I know you don't think you need protecting." His voice was steady, but there was an edge beneath it she felt rather than heard. "I'm telling you, anyway, this isn't about whether you're capable. This is about what happens to things I've come to rely on. Things I've come to rely on." She passed that 3 different ways and wasn't sure which version was true. "Okay," she said. "Say you understand." "I understand." He held her gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he picked up the document and walked out of the office. The 48 hours were not pleasant. She stayed in the building. She worked. She ran projections. She received updates from Crosby in short, factual sentences and responded in kind. She didn't ask questions. She didn't have the right to ask. On the second morning, it was over. She didn't know the details and told herself she was fine with that. Forsyth's operation had been disrupted at a level that meant it would not recover quickly. The Portland property was secure. The 47 individuals in her risk matrix were, according to Crosby, being addressed in order. Harcount came back on the evening of the second day. He was different, not injured. She checked for that immediately, and felt her chest do something uncomfortable in the checking, but worn in a specific way that suggested he'd passed through something significant and had come out the other side only by will. He came to find her in her workspace. He stood in the doorway and said nothing. She said, "It's done. It's done. The Portland property, secured." She nodded. She turned back to her screen and then couldn't look at it. She turned back around. "You came to find me first," she said. He was quiet. "Before Pruitt, before Spence, before anyone else," she said. "You came here." "Yes," he said. She'd spent 8 months building risk matrices and filing structures and contingency plans, and she hadn't built one for this. She hadn't accounted for this variable. She thought of all the times he'd stood in doorways, all the silences with their distinct registers, all the dinner table questions about what she'd wanted, and she felt, for the first time since Remy's voice had been almost gentle on the phone, profoundly miscalculated. "Why?" she said. He crossed the room. He sat on the edge of the desk in a way he'd never done, and he looked at her, and he said, "Because you're the first person in a very long time who told me I was hemorrhaging money and handed me the evidence in the same breath. Because you found a fraud scheme in 20 minutes and cared more about the methodology than the leverage it gave you. Because you asked for your name on the filing and not for money, and I've had people ask me for a great many things over a great many years, and nobody has ever asked me for that." She was quiet. "You've been here 8 months, he said. "You haven't looked for the door. I told you I wouldn't. People say things. I don't." He studied her. That same reading the ledger look that she'd stopped finding unnerving because it had started to feel, somewhere around month 3, like being seen. "I don't know how to do this correctly," he said. It cost him something to say it. She could hear that. "I know how to run a risk assessment. I know how to build a negotiation. I don't know how to." He stopped. "You could just say what you mean," she said. "You've been direct about every other thing." "What I mean," he said, slowly, "is that I would like you to be here. Not as an arrangement, not as a debt cleared, for a reason that has nothing to do with the Rotterdam contracts." She looked at his hands, the scars on them that she'd stopped noticing by month 2 because they'd started seeming simply like him. "The degree program starts in January," she said. "I know. I'm going to have opinions about the filing structure I want for this place, permanent ones. I'm going to want things done a particular way. I know that too, and I'm going to ask questions you might not want to answer." "I've noticed," he said. Something crossed his face that was the first genuinely unguarded thing she'd seen on it. "You're very thorough." "I told you I was," he said very quietly. "Yes, you did." She looked at him across the small space between them and thought about Remy's almost gentle voice and the car in the rain and the $62, and how sometimes the thing that dismantles you is the same thing that finally places you somewhere solid. She thought about her name on the filing. She thought about the way he'd said things I've come to rely on, with that edge underneath it she'd passed 3 ways and was now fairly certain she understood. "Ask me," she said. He looked at her. "You ran through every scenario before you came in here," she said. "I know how you work. You've already planned 4 versions of how this conversation goes." She held his gaze. "So ask me." A long pause. "Will you stay?" he said. She thought about it for exactly as long as it deserved. "Yes," she said, "but I want my name first." "On what?" She looked around the room, at the files, at the locked laptop, at the filing structures she'd built from scratch, at the entity name at the top of every document that had kept her anchored to the fact of her own existence for 8 months. "On everything," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then the unguarded thing came back to his face, small and careful, the way things are when they haven't had much practice. "Done," he said. And that was how she stopped being Remy Duval's collateral and became the woman whose name was on every ledger that mattered, not because someone handed her a title, but because she'd earned every line of it, column by column, in the one language that had always made perfect sense to her. Numbers don't lie, and neither she'd learned, did he?